We're live, Jess.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Virtual Institute for Public Knowledge, IPK, at New York University, and to tonight's book talk for the Amateur Hour, A History of College Teaching in America, featuring the author John Zimmerman in Thanks so much for tuning in tonight. The Amateur Hour is the first full-length history of college teaching in the United States from the 19th century to the present. It sheds new light on the ongoing tension between the modern scholarly ideal, scientific, objective, and dispassionate, and the inevitably subjective nature of day-to-day instruction. I am delighted to be celebrating this new book tonight with John Zimmerman, as well as Richard. But before I introduce them and hand over the mic, I want to thank the IPK team, Zari Lum, Ari Vale Figueroa, and Sam DeJohn for their time and efforts making this and all IPK events possible. I also want to take a moment to underline IPK's commitment to acknowledging that NYU is located on the unceded land of the Lenape peoples, to acknowledging the Lenape community, and to committing to the long process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. And finally, I want to express solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement and to extend a heartfelt thank you to all of the essential workers here in New York and across the globe. And now to introduce our speakers tonight. Author of the Amateur Hour, John Zimmerman, is the Judy and Howard Berkowitz Professor in Education at the University of Pennsylvania. A former Peace Corps volunteer and public school teacher, his scholarship has focused broadly on the ways that different peoples have imagined and debated education across time and space. His most recent work examines campus politics in the US and the teaching of controversial issues in public schools and the history of college teaching. He is the co-editor of the Histories of American Education book series at Cornell University Press, and also the History and Philosophy of Education series at the University of Chicago Press. His next book, Free Speech and Why You Should Give a Damn, will be published in the spring of 2021. And Richard Arum is an American sociologist of education and stratification, best known for his research on student learning, school discipline, race, and inequality in K through 12 and higher education. He is currently Dean of the University of California, Irvine School of Education, and a senior fellow at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. As a quick reminder, please post your questions throughout the talk on Twitter at NYU_IPK or on YouTube. And now I pass the mic to Richard to get us started. Thank you. Please keep each other safe and enjoy.
Thanks very much, Jessica and Jonathan, for agreeing to change up the format a little bit and turn this into a conversation rather than a lecture and a response. And I imagine, Jonathan, one of the reasons why you suggested that was because pedagogically, you might have questions about the lecture format being an effective way to engage an audience.
Yeah, and it was also just going to be more fun to chat with you than to listen to the sound of my voice. Yeah.
Fair enough. So I wanted to start making sure the audience is with us in this conversation, just to start out with what I thought was the primary thesis of the book, at least my reading of it, and you can correct me if I'm off here. But I thought this was a story of historical continuity, where there's been lots of institutional hand-wringing about the quality of college teaching, but in reality, little has changed over time, and there's actually not much we can do to improve teaching, because at its core, it's a personal it's a personal endeavor. It relies on the personality of the instructor and the charisma of the professor. Is that a fair reading or a misreading of the work?
I would say that it's a fair reading, but it's a little extreme. So I think there has been a lot of continuity, but there's also been change. I should say, in all honesty, that I gave very short shrift to the last couple decades because I was trying to get in under a page count, and I figured my value added was, to go deeper into the past. But I do think
I'll interrupt you right there. And I think this book is extraordinarily valuable, and really is a must read for people who think about college teaching, because it does bring back kind of illustrate the extent to which these issues are kind of long-standing.
Yeah, and look, I do think that there's been, like you said, this long pattern of hand-wringing, and I would go even farther. There's been kind of this contrapuntal rhythm of protest and reform. There's been a lot of talk about college teaching for a very long time, but I think it's fair to say that the amount of talk has greatly exceeded the amount of actual change. And I do think that you put your finger on the reason for it. It is an irreducibly personal activity, and that makes it very hard to regulate and hard to improve. And there also, frankly, are some good reasons why we should be gentle and wary as we go about trying to improve it. Because the last thing I would want is for some, very elaborate bureaucratic regime in which Richard, as a dean, measured how many questions each of his faculty members were asking in 50-minute segments and then evaluated them according to that. We can all imagine lots of bad ways to do this that would interfere with what's kind of spontaneous and indeed personal. So I do think that's an ongoing tension.
Yeah, and also to add additional nuance, I recall in the book you point it's in several occasions to structural obstacles within the way universities are structured that also kind of discourage, even a well-meaning dean to start measuring this stuff and working to improve it.
And ironically, because Richard is the dean of an ed school, one of the structural impediments is the status of the ed school itself. Leaving, present company aside, ed schools have been the lesser cousin in the American Research University. They've often been associated with low status, in part because so many of their graduates have been female, and because the status of the teaching profession writ large hasn't been high. And so one of the ongoing stories and one of the ongoing constraints on reform is that any teaching reform is involved inevitably with the ed school, attaches itself to the ed school. And a lot of people elsewhere in the university don't want that. They don't want that attachment. So if you say, well, we need some better systems to improve teaching, they'll say, oh, that sounds like the ed school. And that often ends the conversation.
Yeah, well, since you're bringing dragging the ed school into this, Jonathan, so I'll have to that invites the question about K-12 teaching, teaching in elementary and secondary schools, which your book steers clear of. But I was a little puzzled by the extent to which it's steered clear of some of the parallel reform efforts around K-12 teaching, K-12 teacher preparation. do you think of these as completely distinct spheres,
They're
or?
not. They're not. And again, I probably should have drawn more connections. I think they do come up at different places, indeed, in the discussion of ed schools, because there was a lot of critique, and there has been a lot of critique about how ed schools prepare teachers. Um, uh, and there's also been a lot of critique about how teachers themselves are evaluated. Now we're talking K through 12 teachers. I mean, come on, how many teachers at any moment, including today, K through 12 teachers, do you know who are satisfied with the systems of supervision and evaluation that surround them? I don't know many who say, yeah, I love this system. This is great. It's doing a super job of helping me be better. And given that, I think there's understandable skepticism on the part of higher ed. People say, look, you haven't really done a very good job on the K through 12 realm. Why do we want to visit you on higher ed? Now, there are also some non sequiturs in there as well, right? Just because it hasn't been particularly effective or successful at the K through 12 level doesn't necessarily mean it couldn't be in higher ed. But I think that's the way the politics work.
Yeah, I think lots of that's fair. I wonder though, another distinction that's kind of left out of the book is a focus on a kind of how teaching in the STEM fields has been different and differentially invested in relative to the kind of teaching that you and I do in the humanities and social sciences and related fields. The NSF and other federal agencies and foundations have invested heavily in STEM education. And I think colleagues from those disciplines would challenge your characterization of the way the field is structured today, and the lack of attention to teaching and communities of practice that have formed to kind of work to improve it.
Yes.
Again, I think that's true in humanities and the social sciences, but much less true in many of the STEM fields.
I think that's fair. And I think it's a weakness of the book. And I think it goes back to the fact that I decided really to leave out like the past 2 decades, not completely. But it is during those past 2 decades where I think in the STEM fields, especially in engineering, there's been a lot of renewed attention to this. Let's face it, I mean, in those fields, people are generally more concerned with measurement than, say, in an English department, right? Right. So in some sense, it does make sense that there would be more efforts there to try not just to improve teaching, but to document that you've improved it.
Yeah, but that would leave the social scientist off the hook.
Yeah,
they're supposed to believe in the power of measurement to improve society as well, and you see very little,
much less
in there. And so I think a lot of it has to go back to kind of, this is an account consistent with the sociology of knowledge, where resources are being invested through NSF, through the foundations, and it's in STEM teaching and learning, much less the rest of the academy.
Definitely. And in some of the recent really successful efforts to improve teaching, like at the University of Texas, where they've gotten these often minority students to show these great games. One of the things I find really interesting is generally it's been like in calculus and in chemistry, like that's been the focus. And they've done really interesting things like, send these digital nudges to students that say, gee, we noticed that you didn't do all that well on your last test. Would you like to talk about it? And it turns out that like seeing a video of somebody that looks like you talking about how they flunked their first calculus test but got better after that, like can really help you improve in calculus, which is pretty remarkable. And it's sort of depressing that we don't know enough about that and we don't kind of do it everywhere.
Yeah. I think a lot of those interventions around the technological nudging and the like have been very powerful. But I read your book as being much more skeptical of the possibility for technology to help improve teaching, and you cite some historic examples. You want to speak to
Yeah.
that a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, I am a skeptic. Obviously, technology is a huge area, and we're talking about many different machines at many different moments put to different uses. But I think the general pattern has been that when the institutions grow, which they have, at different points massively and very sharply, we introduce machines to try to accommodate the new flow. So, right after the Second World War with the GI Bill, you have this huge flow of largely veterans, and that's when educational TV kicks in. And it's not a coincidence, right? People say we're just not going to have the hands here, or the space to get this done in our current arrangement. So to accommodate the newcomers, we need this machine. Then in the 60s, when you have another huge burst, largely because of things like the Higher Ed Act, you have another round of machines that are often going to the title program learning. B.F. Skinner called them teaching machines. And although Skinner introduced his teaching machine at Harvard, it was only there for a couple of semesters, and it really wasn't for Harvard. And that's when I think the dominant theme has been in the history of these technologies. We introduce them to bring in newcomers. What's really interesting about our current moment is everyone's on a machine, just like we are right now on our laptops.
Yeah, so we'll continue with that in a second, because I'm going to break to direct my comments to our live audience and ask them to put in, if they're watching it on YouTube, add in your comments to YouTube a question you have, and I'm going to raise your questions because we have a capable staff cutting and pasting those into a Google Doc, which I'm reading out of the left corner of my eye. I can raise those questions, Jonathan. And if you don't like the YouTube format, you can also put these comments apparently in Twitter. You can tweet them with the hashtag @NYU_IPK. And we'll also get those questions cut and pasted into the Google Doc for me to talk in the Zoom. And so with all that saying, in the middle of a pandemic, with all the universities moving into remote instruction, it seems, obviously this book was completed before the pandemic, and it would have been a very different book, particularly around technology, I think.
Yes.
Had you written it today?
I think in two ways. One, I think the class dimension of the technology is right now largely disappearing because everyone's got to do it, right? So, we didn't invent online ed. Online ed has been around since the 90s, but people at Penn didn't teach via online, right? That was for people at Delaware Community College, right? And I think what happened now is there's been in some ways a radically egalitarian moment where everyone has been forced onto the machine. I think the other key difference is if you look back.
And I'll just add a little bit of the irony here. Delaware maybe has invested in the technology and training teachers to work in these online formats and structure courses appropriately. The Penns of the world, not so much, right?
No, I mean, we had to catch up, quote unquote, or try to catch up really on the fly, precisely because, that wasn't our medium, right? That was for other people, right? And other people's kids, right? And now it is our medium. The other thing that's different is the medium itself is different, right? So the other technologies that I referred to, even before TV, there was radio, then television, program learning. They have these kind of flares and fizzles, right? They suddenly become the new thing, but 5 years later, they're the old thing. And they're mostly discarded. And the reason is that the students found them highly impersonal. And in some ways, that goes back to the original theme of the book that you mentioned about sort of the need and the wish for an instruction that's personal. These other technologies, the students said, I just see this guy on a screen, and he's not looking at me. I'm not looking at him. And the irony is that those technologies are often advertised as personal because, we have the great Richard Arum, and he's in California, but we can see him anywhere. And you know, I can also tune into him at any time. So it's personal in the sense that I can do it on my own clock. It's self-paced. But the students eventually found it highly impersonal because they didn't feel like they had a rapport with the instructor or with the other students. And I think that one of the huge questions is whether it's possible to recapitulate that in this media, because this technology, it is different. This is not television. But surely there's a Venn diagram here as well, right? And there's overlap too.
Well, and certainly we don't want to romanticize the in-person experience, where people might feel feel the charisma of a professor while they're sitting in the back of a 150 person classroom, or as a sociologist like Irving Goffman might say, they might want to do the work to help shore up the normalcy and the expected social meaning of the interaction. So they might be more willing to say, yeah, that was a good class, in a way that they might be less willing for a virtual engagement that really isn't of any higher or lower quality.
Right. But look, Richard, you're the sociologist and you're also the Durkheim expert, right? And he talked about this thing called collective effervescence. And I remember learning about that in college because my best college teacher was Eviatar Zerubbabel, who's like a Durkheimian sociologist. And I give him a shout out at the beginning of the book. And to your point, I remember him coming in one day and saying, okay, why do people pray in a church or a synagogue? Can't they do that on their own? In fact, they do that on their own, right? People do pray in private, but not only in private. There must be a reason that they actually go to a collective space to do that, right? And Durkheim's answer was, there's something that, to quote Hamilton, about the room where it happens, right? There's something about the community that's created when people do commune that's just substantively and, well, sociologically different. Sports is another good example, right? Now with these high-res TVs and cameras, you can even see the blades of grass in a sporting event. Yet for some weird reason, people will pay $150 or $250 to go to a sporting event. Why? Not because they can see better, because often they can't see anything, right? It's because of that collective experience. And I think this is just an enormous question for all of us, right? Is there something about being in the same room that we need and that we can't replace via these machines?
Yeah, well, I concede 100% that in terms of how people perceive the social interaction and appreciate and value the social interaction, we all miss right now the ability to get together on a regular basis. It's impoverished all our lives right now, but that's something different than student learning, isn't it? I mean, there may be a through line if those social activities affect individual motivation,
right,
which leads to greater learning.
Right.
But there's, it's a very different thing.
Yeah.
Assessing the teaching and assessing student learning.
Absolutely, right. And despite the best efforts of you and others, I mean, we still have only I think a very primitive idea of how much people are learning. And I wasn't trying to suggest that there's any necessary connection here between kind of their feeling and their enjoyment and what they've learned, because I don't know that to be the case. And I think that's really something we have to find out. The book is sprinkled with these charismatic figures, often people that nobody knew about. Like there are people that are famous at their respective universities for just filling up a room, literally and figuratively, right? And you read these accounts and it really
and these people historically, these people were revered
Oh,
in
absolutely.
in colleges and universities. I'm
Yeah,
not sure. I'm not sure it's the same. It's true to the same extent today.
no, it really isn't. These people were only famous at their respective institutions, which is interesting and sort of speaks to the difference between teaching and research, right? Because there's no national teaching community, right? Like there is a national like research or disciplinary community. But the terms that people use, in their accounts to describe this experience, it was quasi-religious and messianic. When I went into his room, and it was generally a hymn, I felt this spiritual connection to him and to the other people in the room that transported me to a different place and made the material somehow sacred, like like Durkheim would say. And I do think that there is there are fewer such figures now. I think in part because the lecture, quote unquote, has been in some ways discredited, even though it still occurs. Often when institutions create, they say, well, we have so many students, this is the only way we can afford to teach them, by having 150 or 250 of them in a room. But I think it's also true, you hear fewer accounts of the people in that room being enraptured by what the professor at the front of it does, which I think is interesting.
Yeah, I know, and in many universities, we go out of our way to try to encourage the traditional large classroom lecture to be broken up into active learning, right? So that we've built a whole, whole new set of classrooms at UCI and trained faculty
Right.
in active learning, and the whole premise of the building is that you break up the lectures repeatedly and the students swivel and have digital media that they can engage in small groups,
Right.
where the real learning occurs, not the.
Exactly. And I think we're in some ways maybe talking even about different learning here, and in some ways my book is the prehistory of everything you just described, because at every juncture people have complained about the lecture. We didn't invent that either. And the remedies are always some kind of small group activity. Going back to the 1920s, they didn't use the term necessarily active learning, but that was the idea. You had precepts, you had tutorials, you had conferences, and all of these things were designed to create much more intimate communities where students were interacting with each other much more personally, and also with the professor. And look, those can be done well and poorly as well, right? And I think that's the other kind of one of the other takeaways of the book, is that just like we've all been to terrific and terrible lectures, there are terrific and terrible discussion groups. At one juncture in the late 40s, Benjamin Bloom, who like the educators will all recognize because of Bloom's taxonomy, he did this really interesting study that didn't really seem to get any ink, but I found fascinating, where he taped all these discussion classes, like 21 of them. And then what he did was he sat down with the students like 5 days later and ran the tape. This back then would have been a cassette tape, and interviewed the students about different junctures, where the professor is asking the following questions, so-and-so is answering or debating. And he would say to the student, so what was going on in your head at that time? And the student would say, well, I was thinking about the fraternity party, or my girlfriend or boyfriend. And I think Bloom's point was there's no magic in any specific method. It all depends on what's actually happening in people's minds. And that's both a really hard thing to determine, number one, and number two, it's just facile to necessarily connect it to a given method, because all of them can be done well and poorly, and they're all idiosyncratic.
So I'm going to shift grounds a little bit, and suggest to the audience a good pairing of this book, The Amateur Hour. I think The Amateur Hour pairs well with another book that just came out by Aaron Pallas and Anna Newman called Convergent Teaching. Aaron Pallas, of course, a noted sociologist, and Anna Newman, one of the best higher ed researchers of the day. And their book spends a lot more time focused on, because they borrow much more from the K-12 literature. And so they're much more attentive and interested in this notion of culture and how teaching, in order to be effective, has to resonate with the culture of the students.
Mhm.
What do you make of that? I know you've thought about culture a lot
Yeah.
and have kind of interrogated the notion of kind of uh,
Yeah.
of coherent cultures in the first place. Could you speak to this a little bit?
Right. Well, first of all, I think it's a terrific book, and I do draw on it at the end because I think it's one of the best statements of what we've actually learned about how teaching and learning works. And that's super important, and not enough people know about that stuff. With respect to culture, I am somewhat skeptical because I think a lot of those claims often collapse the differences between people who are labeled a certain culture and end up becoming essentially a self-fulfilling prophecy. I've heard this sort of convergent learning and teaching, or even active learning, as something that described as something that's particularly, let's say, congruent with certain minority cultures. And I'm deeply skeptical of that claim. This idea that for majority cultures, this lecture thing can work. But certain minority cultures, they're more friendly and more akin to a certain kind of discussion and a back and forth. I think that collapses huge differences within these different groups, and I think can end up reinforcing some ugly stereotypes as well. I think that the kind of teaching they describe, I think that's good for everyone, actually. Um, I don't know that everyone will respond in the same way, and we are all different. We come from different places, and culture is going to inflect that, for sure. But I think also, if I may, in the wake of an election where, the losing white candidate, who made many racist appeals, polled more non-white voters and a greater fraction of non-white voters than any Republican candidate since Richard Nixon, whose reelection campaign was chaired by Jackie Robinson. I think that all of that should make us all very skeptical about some of these facile equations between somebody's phenotype and the way they vote or the way that they learn.
Yeah, well, I'll put an asterisk on the voting results, because I think it's still too early, and a lot of those inferences are drawn from exit polls, and
Yeah.
voting was skewed in particular ways this time. So we'll put that aside.
Yeah.
That's it. But the general point is well taken. So and we'll get to the questions shortly. Please put them in the YouTube, or again on Twitter at NYU_IPK, and I'll get to them momentarily. But I had a few more things I wanted to work through with you before we got there. One is you draw on Weber's work around authority, and talk about how this bureaucratic authority is really doesn't lend itself well to the personal nature of teaching that requires a personal relationship between the individual teacher and student. And so it rests much more in charisma. But you left out, I know you know Weber as well as I do, John. You left out the traditional forms of authority. And what do you make there? Has that changed? You think that might have changed over time? Has that been undermined? Has that Can we still draw as college professors on traditional authority the way we once did? Or maybe there was never really a moment in the 20th century or 21st that...
I think that there's a real tendency on the part of all of us professors to imagine some time when professors had a lot more sort of credence and authority in the culture. But we've always actually been whipping boys for the culture. And, Hofstadter wrote about this in Anti-Intellectualism in American Life. And my favorite examples go back to pop culture and the Marx Brothers. You look at the Marx Brothers movies, and a lot of it is just targeted at university professors. It was an easy thing to make fun of. And in one of them, I always get them mixed up, and in one of them, Groucho is a university president, and he wants to build a football stadium, which is funny. And somebody says, well, then we can't build the dorms. Where are the students going to sleep? And Groucho says, in class, like they always do. And everybody laughs. And during the Cold War, there was a comedian named Irwin Corey, and his whole act was being a ridiculous professor and just saying blabber.
And I confess, Jonathan, when you alluded to him in this book, I went on YouTube and pulled up the old some of the old videos of him.
Right, and it's funny because so many people go to college, right? As college becomes a mass institution, it becomes funnier, it becomes more recognizable, But we're out of it. We dress poorly, we're radically uncool. I don't really think there was a time when there was a huge amount of kind of inherent respect that attached to it. I do think, though, relations between students and teachers have changed. There's no question about that. But I don't think that speaks so much to the teacher's authority per se, as it does just kind of to habits of socialization, and what you sociologists would say roles. And David Reisman, who I think was the most important person that ever wrote about these subjects, he picked up on this in the 70s. And he started saying, what's really interesting now is that the students and teachers increasingly imagine themselves as friends with each other. And that was new. In earlier eras, it would have been radically uncool to see your professor as a friend, and especially to have your peers perceive that you saw the teacher as a friend. That would have made you a blue or a bootlick or all these other terms that were assigned across history for people that sucked up to the professor. There was a lot of hostility between these groups, and there was a lot of peer pressure to maintain that hostility.
So I'm going to go quick lightning round questions. Your one sentence answers, if you can. And then we're going to go to the questions from the audience. And so this, I'm wondering what advice, after doing all this work on teacher ed, what advice you would give to different parties? And you already gave me my advice as dean: don't measure and muck with this stuff. What advice would you give a provost?
Give a provost?
About college teaching.
Yeah. I think to try to accent and disseminate the knowledge that we've gathered more than we've done thus far, right? The way to a professor's heart is through the intellect, if that's not a contradiction in terms, right? And so long as people see this as simply an emotional matter, or even, if you will, a personal one, right? I don't think it's going to appeal to them. Thanks to people like Aaron and Anna, I think we do have a growing body of knowledge about what good teaching is. But what we don't have, and this goes to the title of the book, is really a set of mechanisms to try to institutionalize that, or even to recognize it. I mean, look, Richard, you and I care about this stuff. How many people know who Pallas and Newman are, or know what that book is, right? There are 1.5 million college teachers, and my strong guess is almost none of them. So I think the first thing that I would try
I was going to say something else, John. I think it's noteworthy that historians of your caliber, sociologists of Aaron's caliber, higher ed scholars of honest, they're all writing about college teaching. That seems to me noteworthy and significant, right? I mean, you've looked at over the last 100 years, there's always
Yeah.
been some ferment here, but that seems
Right. Well, look, I mean, leaving aside your loose use of the adjective prominent, I mean, I was amazed when I set out to do this book that didn't exist, that there were 10,000 histories of higher ed in this country and not a single soup to nuts history about teaching at these institutions. I just couldn't believe it. I mean, I assumed I wasn't going to do the book because I assumed I would find 5 or 10 others, and there were 0. I mean, obviously some people have written about this in bits and places, but my book didn't exist. And that is, I mean, and that it's lucky it gave me something to write about, but it's kind of incredible when you think about that nobody had done that.
So back to the quick responses, okay? Advice to a colleague on about improving teaching.
I think the most important thing is to bring in as many peers as possible. Look, we're already evaluated by our students, and that's good because the students can tell us some important things, like, does the professor return work on time? It turns out that that's really important to people's learning, and only the students can tell you that. Is the professor available? Does she or he make himself available outside of class? Also very important. The students can tell us that. But they can't really tell us how well we're teaching. And here's why. If you were a physicist, Richard, I don't think I could visit your classroom and evaluate your teaching. I think I know maybe enough about sociology that I would have maybe a better chance. But physics or chemistry or math, I don't think I could do it. I would still maybe have some things to observe or remark upon. I would like to do it. I'd be interested in it, but I wouldn't want my evaluation to be determinative in any way of what you do as a physicist, because I just don't know enough about physics. So, I think creating cultures in these departments of, peer review and peer evaluation, where people are not just observing classes, but looking at syllabi, looking at other sorts of, kind of written exercises, and trying to figure out, A, what's happening, because lots of times we don't know, and B, what would make it better. We can do that. It's just we've chosen not to.
Okay, last question, then I'm really going to the audience questions. Advice for an undergraduate puzzling about the state of college teaching today, as they sit on their bed, and someone thinks that the best response to remote instruction is taking everything they've done in the classroom and moving it into a Zoom format and calling that online education.
My advice to the students is advice that my employers at my institution won't like. My advice to the students is, when something isn't working for you and you're not learning, shout that to the high heavens, to anybody that will listen, and keep shouting. One of the things that I was surprised to find out in the book was how much organized student protest there's been in the past about the poor quality of teaching. It's a recurring theme. In the 1920s, in fact, there was a whole conference about it, student-driven, in upstate New York, where delegates from over 50 different colleges and universities showed up to critique and complain about the poor quality of the instruction that they were receiving. They even invited James Harvey Robinson, who was a historian at Columbia and a well-known critic of bad teaching, to give the keynote. And what he says in his keynote, which is pretty cool, is like, this is where the change is going to come from. That's what Robinson said. He said, it's not going to come from Aram or Zimmerman. It's going to come from you. So if this isn't working, let everyone know. Even if it didn't cost $1 gazillion, you should let everyone know. But given that it does, you should especially let everyone know.
I was going to say that was back in an era before students amassed these incredible debt to take on
Right.
college. And speaking of debt, we have a question from Caitlin Zaloom, who wonders whether the changing demographic characteristics of the students, higher education has been massified over the past 100 years. And so different types of students are coming today to school than did in the past. How does that piece play into this question of teacher quality?
Well, look, it makes teaching harder. Everybody knows this, right? Anybody that's ever taught a heterogeneous room knows that it's a lot harder to do than a homogeneous one, right? We have people not just from different backgrounds, but people just with different kinds of privilege, right? I always say to my undergraduate students, look, if you come to college and you're not a great writer, that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. It means you didn't have good English teachers. And people have variety in that zone, right? And once you massify this, you're going to have crazy variety. And that makes it much, much harder. I think that there was no golden age when the teaching was terrific, that's for sure. But the teaching was probably easier to do for the teachers when there were smaller numbers. And most people came from similar backgrounds. I think, if anything, what this has done is just kind of, I would just say, reinforce the challenge and increased it.
Our next question from our IPK host, Eric Kleinenberg. He wonders about all the learning that happens on college campuses outside of the classroom. Your book focuses on college teaching, but college teaching, we think, is likely only a small part of how students are developing in college and learning. A lot of it is peer interactions, Kleinenberg suggests. What do you think? What do you think about that piece of this?
Well, look, this is a longstanding debate, going back to people like, Aston at UCLA about engagement and all the stuff, Richard, that you grapple with in your books. I'd say in response to Eric that, there's something oddly poignant about this moment, because I think he's right, and college has actually been reduced to classes, which is weird and interesting, and I feel this very poignantly in my freshman seminar that I'm teaching this semester, which is called Why College? Historical Perspectives, which I teach over Zoom. And we talk about Greek life, and we talk about the development of sort of dating and gender relations on campus. And these are all things that people are not experiencing because they're studying in the basement, which is always where one is, of the home they grew up in. Look, Eric's right. Surely people learn in all kinds of different ways, and all of us can remember activities that we engaged in, I think, as young people outside of the classroom that were hugely educational. I was the editor of the college newspaper at Columbia, and I learned vastly more from that than in any class that I took. And yet, at the same time, I think, your work, Richard, and others have shown us that the classes these students take are woefully uneven, as is the instructional quality. And we should be able to find a place where we acknowledge that these classes are not, as Eric is suggesting, the be-all and end-all of learning, but that we're still radically, all of us, underperforming in them. And especially given the sticker price and all the tension surrounding that Kate has taught us about, that's just not defensible. It just isn't.
I'm going to combine two questions from the audience. One from Elizabeth King, a doctoral student who says, why aren't we being trained as PhD students to teach? What should we be learning? And the related question from David Dunbar, do college teachers need to know anything about learning? If so, what is vital and how much does one need to know? And if not, if there's nothing, uh,
Yeah.
no knowledge we've accumulated in the science of learning that's relevant, why is that the case?
Well, this is another kind of recurring theme and a sad theme in the book, is that, to go back to Caitlin Sloom's question about massification, the other thing massification did is it led us to offload a lot of the teaching function onto graduate students. And even after the state of California said that grad students can't teach their own classes, UCLA just blew that off. That was one of these amazing archival moments where I actually find administrators saying, okay, the state has said that we can't do this, but let's just do it and not tell anybody, because we don't have an option. We have too many students. We don't have enough professors. All right, we'll have grad students teach them. The real problem, though, is there hasn't been, and this cuts back to the amateur hour and professionalization. In most places, there has not been a systematic effort to expose grad students as part of their training to the complexities and even the practice of teaching. And when those efforts have happened, they've been scattershot, and they've almost they've just kind of confirmed the whole prejudice against teaching. Everyone has their favorite episode in a book, and mine is in the 50s and early 60s, Harvard and Radcliffe decided that, okay, they need to do something about this problem, i.e. the problem the questioner was referring to, that we're not really preparing people for the classroom. So what they do is they create these non-credit seminars, they're voluntary, where grad students can show up and they can get some pointers on teaching. Well, I actually found a transcript of one of these seminars, and the guy comes in. He was actually a very prominent biologist at Harvard, very well known. And the first thing he says to them is, okay, listen, I'm glad you're here, but the first thing you have to understand is your job and your career is only going to depend on the research you do. Okay, so he says that at the teaching seminar, which is really kind of interesting and depressing and hilarious. And then he says, look, here's the way I look at your graduate career. When I was in the military, he fought like in Okinawa or someplace place in the Second World War. There was a soldier that got ill, and he seemed to have an appendicitis. But the military doc at Okinawa, or whatever it was, he had never done an appendectomy. So he captured a stray dog, and he performed an appendectomy on the dog. And then he was good to go. He felt confident, all right, to go ahead and do the appendectomy on the soldier. So he said, look upon your undergrads now as dogs, okay? He said this, right? And, you can experiment on them. Nothing terrible is going to happen, but it'll give you some experience for your next job. So this was the great seminar for enhancing teaching at Harvard. This happened.
Well, a good explanation for why students get together and should demand improved teaching. We have a question from next from Kiara Way, who says that she agrees with you that faculty have less authority than they imagine, but then wonders why do right-wing media and pundits worry so much about left-leaning faculty, since in reality they're largely inconsequential?
Look, it's a very fair question. And often when I read in the Wall Street Journal or some other place about how at my own institution people are being indoctrinated into socialism, I often wonder why over half the graduates of my institution end up in the financial world. It doesn't seem like a great place for a socialist. And if what we're trying to do is indoctrinate people into socialism, we're probably not doing a very good job. That being said, I will say, and I've written other books on this subject, that there is indoctrination at American universities. It may not be always successful, but there are certainly political biases that are imposed on, or that professors try to impose on students. And that does hurt our reputation in the commonweal, right? We're in a moment right now where people don't like us very much. It's very hard to go hat in hand to a state legislature and ask them for more public money for education if those legislators think that some of the professors are propagandizing their students. And so I take the point of the question, right? Professors don't have nearly as much influence as the critics claim, but at the same time, some of their behaviors are definitely hurting the cause if the cause is creating public sentiment behind college as a public good.
So we're nearing the end of the hour. I want to make sure you have an opportunity to raise a topic that we haven't yet touched on that you think is important and central to this line of work, or again give you an opportunity to.
Well, I'd say that actually the one thing that hasn't come up, although it did indirectly, is connected to my last comment, which is that I think it's fair to say, no matter what the exit polls say, that ultimately what they'll do is they will reveal that our country is hugely divided. And we have not done a very good job of teaching people how to talk to each other. The only thing that I can see that connects Trump world and Biden world is the shock expressed in both of those worlds at the size of the opponent. So in Biden world, people said, God, I can't believe there's 71 million Trumpers. Who are these people? And in Trump world, people said exactly the same thing about Biden world. This expression of shock that reveals, among other things, our separation, our mutual ignorance and often recrimination. And that is connected to the issue of teaching because, when you interview both high school and college students and you ask them, how much debate and deliberation has there been in your classrooms? The answer is shockingly little. So why exactly would we expect people to be able to do this if we don't teach them how? It's certainly not a natural behavior. It may actually, if you believe some of the psychologists, be unnatural. To me, the fact that we talk past each other or shout at each other and can't communicate is depressing, but not surprising. And it's not surprising because we haven't set up the teaching function to promote it. Schools and universities are our public institutions for teaching people how to speak across their disagreements. And there's no way to interpret the past week except for saying it's been an epic fail for education. I don't see any other possible interpretation. We have not taught those skills or even the will to exert them.
The skills that are central to democracy, critical thinking, the ability to reason. Our friend out at Stanford, Sam Weinberg, has this online civic reasoning measures that. We certainly have not done a good job on that either, and also the old-fashioned intellectual virtues of intellectual humility, openness to new information and changing our opinions.
No, definitely not. And the other piece of research that's really relevant, I think, to this discussion is this survey that just came out from the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, which is, I think, the most elaborate survey of campus political climate ever. 22,000 students at 55 different colleges and universities. And the takeaway is that Republican and Democrat students are both afraid to speak their minds. Republican students more afraid, but over half of Democratic students say that they bite their tongues for fear of being attacked, either in person or online. And that too, I think, speaks to the moment. It speaks to the atmosphere on our campuses and, frankly, our failure to try to correct for that in our classrooms.
Yeah, I would say the atmosphere on campus, the culture in the larger society. Also, technology is a piece of that, right? Technology amplifies
Yeah.
these disagreements or the missing nuance in comments, right? It amplifies tremendously and can create even greater barriers to having honest dialogue.
And as a lot of people have pointed out, it's not rocket science. People will say things on social media that they will not say in person. Yeah.
So we are going to turn now to Jessica Coffey to close down the event. Jonathan, it's been a real pleasure talking with you.
And thank you, Richard, for the great questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Jonathan and Richard. It's been a pleasure to join you in your conversation tonight. And I ask the public viewing this conversation to join me in thanking both of our speakers for this illuminating look at the past, present, and the future of higher education, and in congratulating John on this fantastic and important work. So to learn even more and to get yourself a copy of the Amateur Hour, which was just published a few weeks ago, check out Johns Hopkins University Press for your own copy. We have some great events coming up in the next few weeks at IPK, including a Co-opting AI fiction event this Monday evening, and many more. To check out our offerings, please go to ipk.nyu.edu. Have a great evening, and please keep each other safe. And I hope to see you at some of our future IPK discussions.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks again.
Thank you, John. Richard.